Picture this, it's a warm Roman evening in 1501. The most sacred halls of the Vatican echo not with prayers, but with the sound of wild laughter, clinking goblets, and whispered conspiracies. In the Pope's private chambers, a stunningly beautiful young woman with golden hair and piercing eyes sits at the head of a table, surrounded by cardinals, nobles, and foreign dignitaries. But this isn't just any woman. This is Lucrezia Borgia, the Pope's daughter, and she's about to orchestrate one of the most scandalous events in Vatican history. What you're about to hear will shatter everything you thought you knew about the Catholic Church's holiest institution, because for nearly a decade, the Vatican wasn't ruled by God's representative on earth. It was controlled by a family so corrupt, so ruthless, and so morally bankrupt that they turned the seat of Christianity into their personal playground of sin, murder, and unthinkable depravity. And at the center of it all, a woman whose very existence was a blasphemy, the Pope's illegitimate daughter, Lucrezia Borgia. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's darkest chapters, a story so shocking that the Church tried to bury it for centuries. We're talking about a time when the Vatican was ruled not by divine authority, but by a Spanish family who treated the papacy like their personal criminal empire. This is the story of how Lucrezia Borgia, a woman who should never have existed according to church law, became one of the most powerful and feared figures in Renaissance Italy. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. Everything I'm about to tell you actually happened. This isn't fiction. This isn't a Netflix drama. This is documented history that the Catholic Church would prefer you never learned about. To understand how Lucrezia Borgia came to wield such terrifying power, we need to go back to 1492. Not just any year. This was the year Christopher Columbus reached the Americas, but more importantly for our story, it was the year that Rodrigo Borgia bought his way to the papal throne and became Pope Alexander VI. Now let me paint you a picture of what the papacy was supposed to represent. The Pope was meant to be Christ's representative on earth, a man of unquestionable moral authority, sworn to celibacy, devoted entirely to God and the salvation of souls. The Vatican was supposed to be a sacred space, a beacon of Christian virtue that guided the faithful toward righteousness. But Rodrigo Borgia, he was everything a pope should never be. This man had openly fathered at least 7 illegitimate children with multiple mistresses. He had bought cardinals' votes with gold, promises of power, and threats of violence. And once he wore the papal crown, he didn't even pretend to follow the rules he was supposed to enforce. Imagine the shock of devout Catholics across Europe when they realized their spiritual leader was living like a medieval crime boss. But here's the truly disturbing part. Rodrigo Borgia didn't just break his vows in private. He flaunted his corruption openly, and he used his papal authority to advance his illegitimate children to positions of incredible power. And among these children, none would become more notorious, more feared, or more influential than his daughter Lucrezia. Lucrezia Borgia was born in 1480, the product of her father's affair with Vannozza de Catanei, one of his many mistresses. From the moment she drew breath, Lucrezia's very existence was a living contradiction to everything the Catholic Church claimed to stand for. She was proof of the Pope's sins, walking evidence of his hypocrisy. But instead of hiding this shameful secret, Rodrigo Borgia did something unprecedented. He embraced it. He brought Lucrezia into the Vatican itself, raised her in the heart of the Catholic Church, and began grooming her not for a convent, but for political power. Picture young Lucrezia growing up in the papal apartments, while other children her age were learning their catechism and preparing for humble, pious lives. She was receiving an education that would make Machiavelli jealous. She learned to speak multiple languages fluently: Latin, Italian, Spanish, French, and Catalan. She studied rhetoric, philosophy, and most importantly, the dark art of political manipulation. But here's what's truly chilling about Lucrezia's upbringing. She wasn't just being educated, she was being weaponized. Her father and her brother Cesare, another of the Pope's illegitimate children who would become one of history's most ruthless military commanders, they were turning this beautiful, intelligent young woman into the perfect political tool. By the time Lucrezia reached adolescence, she had already mastered skills that most courtiers took decades to learn. She could charm foreign diplomats, manipulate powerful nobles, and most terrifyingly of all, she had learned to use her beauty and intelligence to extract secrets that could destroy entire kingdoms. Contemporary accounts describe her as breathtakingly beautiful, golden hair that caught the light like spun silk, mesmerizing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul, and a voice so melodious that hardened warriors would find themselves confessing their deepest secrets just to keep her talking. But don't mistake this for some innocent fairy tale princess. Even as a teenager, Lucrezia was already showing signs of the calculating ruthlessness that would make her legendary. Visitors to the Vatican reported feeling simultaneously enchanted and terrified in her presence, as if they were staring into the eyes of a beautiful predator. When Lucrezia turned 13, barely more than a child by today's standards, her father made a decision that would thrust her into the brutal world of Renaissance politics. He arranged her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza, the Lord of Pesaro and a member of one of Italy's most powerful families. Now, this wasn't a marriage born of love or even mutual respect. This was a cold, calculated political transaction. Rodrigo Borgia needed the Sforza family's military support and their extensive spy network. Giovanni Sforza needed the Pope's blessing for his territorial ambitions. And Lucrezia? She was the currency in this unholy bargain. But here's where the story takes its first truly dark turn. The marriage ceremony itself was held in the Vatican, officiated by the Pope himself. Can you imagine the sheer audacity? The supposed moral leader of the Christian world was personally conducting the wedding of his illegitimate daughter in the holiest place in Catholicism. The wedding feast that followed was described by shocked witnesses as more reminiscent of a pagan orgy than a Christian celebration. Wine flowed like rivers, courtesans mingled freely with cardinals, and the Pope himself was seen dancing with women who were definitely not nuns. But the real horror was just beginning, because within 3 years, the Borgia family's political needs had changed, and Giovanni Sforza had outlived his usefulness. What happened next would establish a pattern that would define Lucrezia's entire life, and it would show the world just how far the Borgias were willing to go to maintain their power. In 1497, Pope Alexander VI declared that Lucrezia's marriage to Giovanni Sforza was null and void. His reasoning? He claimed the marriage had never been consummated, a blatant lie that everyone knew was false. Giovanni Sforza had been married to Lucrezia for 3 years, and there were numerous witnesses to their relationship. But here's the truly sick part. When Giovanni Sforza protested this obvious fraud, he found himself facing a choice that no man should ever have to make. He could either agree to the annulment and flee for his life, or he could fight it and face the full wrath of the Borgia family, which, as he well knew, was often a death sentence. Giovanni chose to live. He signed the annulment papers and fled to northern Italy, but not before making some shocking accusations that would haunt the Borgias for generations. He claimed that the real reason for the annulment wasn't political necessity. It was because Pope Alexander VI wanted his daughter back for his own twisted purposes. The implications of this accusation were so horrifying that most historians didn't dare write about them for centuries, but the whispers spread throughout the courts of Europe like wildfire, whispers of an unholy relationship between father and daughter that defied every law of God and nature. Now, stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you gets much darker. As Lucrezia's influence within the Vatican grew, so did the rumors about her methods, and the most persistent, most terrifying of these rumors involved poison. You see, during the Renaissance, poison was the weapon of choice for those who preferred subtlety to swords. It was silent, often undetectable, and could be administered by someone you trusted completely. And according to numerous historical accounts, Lucrezia Borgia became one of history's most skilled practitioners of this deadly art. The stories began circulating almost immediately after her first marriage was annulled. Guests at Vatican dinner parties would speak in hushed tones about the beautiful Pope's daughter who always wore a hollow ring, a ring that, they whispered, contained a white powder that could kill a man within hours of being slipped into his wine. But here's what makes these stories particularly chilling. They weren't just gossip. There were documented cases of people who opposed the Borgia family mysteriously falling ill and dying after dining with Lucrezia. In 1497, the same year her first marriage was annulled, a young cardinal who had been critical of Pope Alexander VI's corruption died suddenly after attending a feast where Lucrezia was the hostess. The symptoms were always the same: violent stomach pains, convulsions, and death within 24 hours. The victims were always people who posed some threat to Borgia power, and Lucrezia was always present at their last meal. Imagine being a noble or a cardinal in Rome during this period. Every invitation to dine with the Pope's daughter became a potential death sentence. You couldn't refuse. That would be seen as an insult to the Pope himself. But accepting meant placing your life in the hands of a woman who was rumored to collect poisons like other people collected jewelry. Contemporary diplomatic letters describe the atmosphere of terror that surrounded Lucrezia. The Venetian ambassador wrote to his doge, "One does not dine with Madonna Lucrezia without first making peace with God." The French envoy reported that several of his colleagues had mysteriously died after crossing the Borgias, and that the Pope's daughter has become more feared than her brother's armies. But the poison rumors were just the beginning, because as Lucrezia's power grew, so did the stories of her sexual appetite and her complete disregard for Christian morality. What I'm about to describe to you represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of Christianity. Under Pope Alexander VI's rule, the Vatican became the setting for events so depraved that they would make ancient Roman emperors blush. The most infamous of these events was what became known as the Banquet of Chestnuts, held in the Papal Palace in October 1501. Contemporary accounts describe an evening that started as a dinner party and devolved into something that can only be described as an organized orgy in the heart of Christendom. According to the detailed diary of Johannes Burchard, the Pope's own master of ceremonies, 50 courtesans were invited to dance naked around chestnuts scattered on the floor. Prizes were offered to the cardinals and guests who could perform the most times with these women. And presiding over this entire spectacle, Pope Alexander VI himself, along with his daughter Lucrezia and his son Cesare. Now imagine, if you will, the psychological impact of witnessing such a scene. Here were the supposed moral leaders of the Christian world, including the Pope's own daughter, not just tolerating but actively orchestrating an event that violated every principle they claimed to represent. But this wasn't an isolated incident. According to multiple historical sources, these kinds of events became regular occurrences at the Vatican during the Borgia papacy. The papal apartments, where saints and martyrs should have been honored, instead hosted gambling parties, elaborate feasts featuring exotic foods and wines, and entertainments that would have been considered scandalous even in the most decadent secular courts. Lucrezia wasn't just a passive participant in these events. She was often the orchestrator. Diplomatic reports describe her moving through these gatherings like a spider in her web, using the relaxed atmosphere and flowing wine to extract political secrets from drunk and compromised guests. Think about the power dynamics at play here. Cardinals who should have been spiritual advisors were instead being blackmailed with evidence of their participation in these events. Foreign ambassadors found themselves compromised and vulnerable to Borgia manipulation. And at the center of it all was Lucrezia, using her beauty, her intelligence, and her father's authority to build a network of control that stretched across Europe. The psychological warfare was brilliant and terrifying. By creating an atmosphere where everyone was complicit in breaking their most sacred vows, the Borgias ensured that no one could expose them without exposing themselves. It was mutual assured destruction, Renaissance style. But here's where Lucrezia's story takes an even more sinister turn. In 1498, barely a year after her first marriage was annulled, she was married again, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, the Duke of Bisceglie, and an illegitimate son of the King of Naples. This marriage seemed different from the start. Contemporary accounts suggest that Lucrezia and Alfonso actually cared for each other, that there was genuine affection between them. For a brief moment, it appeared that Lucrezia might have found some happiness despite the twisted circumstances of her upbringing. But happiness was a luxury the Borgias couldn't afford, because by 1500, the political situation in Italy had shifted dramatically. The Borgias' alliance with Naples was no longer advantageous. In fact, Alfonso's family connections had become a liability to their ambitions. What happened next would demonstrate just how completely Lucrezia had embraced her family's ruthless philosophy, and it would earn her a reputation for cruelty that would echo through the centuries. On July 15, 1500, Alfonso of Aragon was brutally attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. He was stabbed multiple times and left for dead. Miraculously, he survived the initial assault and was taken to the papal palace to recover. For several weeks, it seemed like he might pull through. He was young, strong, and had the best medical care available. But here's where the story becomes truly chilling. Alfonso was recovering under the personal care of his wife, Lucrezia. She never left his bedside, personally prepared his meals, and administered his medications. To outside observers, she appeared to be the devoted wife, nursing her husband back to health with touching dedication. But on August 18, 1500, Alfonso of Aragon died suddenly and unexpectedly. The official cause of death was given as complications from his wounds, but the timing was suspiciously convenient for the Borgias, who had been negotiating a new alliance that required Lucrezia to be free to marry again. The rumors started immediately. Had Lucrezia, the woman who had shown such tender care for her husband, actually been slowly poisoning him? Had she used those intimate moments of care to administer death rather than healing? We'll never know for certain, but what we do know is that within months of Alfonso's death, Lucrezia was being courted by the powerful d'Este family of Ferrara. Her period of mourning was remarkably brief, and her transition from grieving widow to eligible bride was seamlessly orchestrated by her father. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. Crossing the Borgias was deadly, but being married to one might be even more dangerous. In 1502, at the age of 22, Lucrezia Borgia entered into her third marriage, this time to Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. But this wasn't just another political arrangement. This marriage would transform Lucrezia from a papal tool into an independent power player, and it would reveal the full extent of her capabilities as a ruler and manipulator. The wedding itself was a spectacle that shocked even Renaissance Italy's jaded nobility. The dowry that Pope Alexander VI provided for his daughter was so enormous that it bankrupted several smaller Italian states. But more than the money, it was the guest list that really sent a message. Kings, queens, cardinals, and the most powerful families in Europe all came to witness the marriage of the Pope's illegitimate daughter. But here's what makes this period truly fascinating and terrifying. For the first time in her life, Lucrezia was operating with relative independence from her father and brother. And what she accomplished in Ferrara would prove that she had learned her lessons well. Within months of arriving in Ferrara, Lucrezia had completely transformed the court. She established herself not just as a duchess, but as a patron of the arts, a diplomatic power broker, and most importantly, as the real decision-maker behind her husband's rule. Contemporary letters from the court of Ferrara paint a picture of a woman operating at a level of political sophistication that was unprecedented for the time. She maintained correspondence with kings and queens across Europe, negotiated treaties on behalf of Ferrara, and managed to keep her duchy neutral and prosperous during some of the most turbulent years in Italian history. But it was her intelligence network that really set her apart. Remember those skills she had learned in the Vatican, the ability to extract secrets, to read people's true intentions, to manipulate through charm and intimidation. In Ferrara, she perfected these abilities into something approaching an art form. Visitors to the court would arrive expecting to meet a notorious papal daughter with a scandalous reputation. Instead, they encountered a woman of incredible intelligence and refinement, who could discuss philosophy with scholars, military strategy with generals, and economic policy with merchants, often in the same conversation. But underneath that cultured exterior, the same ruthless calculation that had defined her youth continued to operate. Those who opposed her found themselves isolated, their allies mysteriously turning against them, their secrets somehow becoming public knowledge at the most inconvenient times. One particularly telling incident occurred in 1503, when a group of Ferrarese nobles attempted to limit Lucrezia's influence over her husband. Within 6 months, 3 of the conspirators had died under mysterious circumstances, 2 others had fled the duchy in fear for their lives, and the remainder had become Lucrezia's most vocal supporters. The transformation was so complete and so swift that foreign ambassadors began reporting that they weren't sure who was really ruling Ferrara, Alfonso d'Este or his terrifying wife. But even as Lucrezia was building her power base in Ferrara, the foundation of her family's empire was beginning to crumble, and in August 1503, everything changed with shocking suddenness. Pope Alexander VI died. Now, the official cause of death was given as fever, but rumors immediately began circulating that the Pope had been poisoned, possibly by his own son Cesare, or even by Lucrezia herself. The idea wasn't as far-fetched as it might sound. By 1503, the Borgia family's internal dynamics had become increasingly strained, with each member pursuing their own ambitions and viewing the others as potential obstacles. But here's what makes Lucrezia's reaction to her father's death so revealing of her true character. While her brother, Cesare, panicked and made a series of tactical errors that would ultimately lead to his downfall, Lucrezia immediately began implementing a survival strategy that showed she had been preparing for this moment for years. Within hours of receiving news of her father's death, she had sent coded messages to her allies across Europe, secured the loyalty of key figures in Ferrara, and begun distancing herself from the more scandalous aspects of her family's reputation. It was a masterclass in political damage control, executed with a speed and precision that stunned contemporary observers. The new pope, Julius II, was a sworn enemy of the Borgias. One of his first acts was to begin investigations into the corruption of the previous papacy. Cardinals who had participated in Alexander VI's orgies suddenly found themselves facing charges of moral turpitude. Officials who had accepted Borgia bribes were stripped of their positions and exiled. But Lucrezia? Somehow she emerged from this purge not just unscathed, but actually strengthened. While investigators were gathering evidence against her father and brother, she was presenting herself as a reformed woman who had been corrupted by her family's influence, but was now dedicated to pious Christian living. The transformation was so complete that it bordered on the miraculous. The woman who had been whispered about as a poisoner and manipulator suddenly became known for her charitable works and religious devotion. The Duchess, who had been feared for her political ruthlessness, began hosting religious retreats and funding monastery construction. Was this genuine repentance, or was it the most brilliant political reinvention in history? The evidence suggests it was probably both. Lucrezia was genuinely tired of the constant danger and moral corruption that had defined her youth, but she was also smart enough to realize that survival required adaptation.